The man who taught me what real strength looks like is my stepfather, Daniel Brooks. My son said into the microphone, while 2,000 people applauded around me. I kept smiling for exactly 3 more seconds before I stood up, picked up my purse, and walked out of the graduation arena without looking back. The Ohio State field house smelled like fresh coffee, floor polish, and expensive perfume that afternoon. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the polished gym floor beneath banners in scarlet and gray. Families waved phones in the air, trying to capture every moment. Mothers cried openly. Fathers slapped their sons on the shoulder. Somewhere behind me, a baby fussed while someone laughed too loudly near the concession stand. It should have felt warm, celebratory. Instead, I remember thinking how cold the air conditioning was against my skin. I had spent 3 hours getting ready that morning. At 67, I no longer cared much about makeup, but Ryan's graduation felt important enough to make an effort. I curled my silver blonde hair carefully, pinned on the pearl earrings my mother left me, and wore the navy blue dress I had saved for special occasions. The same dress Ryan once told me made me look elegant when he was 16 and still hugged me before school. I even brought the bouquet myself. White lilies and blue hydrangeas wrapped in satin ribbon. $84 at the florist downtown, which felt extravagant on my retirement budget. But this was my son's day. My only child. My entire world for 22 years. I arrived 40 minutes early because Ryan always hated being late. Some habits never leave a mother. The seats reserved for family were already half full by the time I found mine near the front. Daniel sat 3 chairs away wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to. Beside him sat Melissa, his sister, and Chloe Bennett, Ryan's girlfriend, with her polished blonde hair and perfectly manicured pale pink nails. Chloe smiled politely when she saw me, though it looked more practiced than sincere. Evelyn, Daniel said warmly as I sat down. Beautiful day for this. I nodded. It is. His smile never changed. Daniel Brooks always knew exactly how to smile. That was part of what made him dangerous. Most people would never understand what I mean by that. They would see a successful financial consultant in his late 50s who volunteered at charity galas and remembered birthdays and always tipped restaurant servers 25%. They would see the man who paid for Ryan's final year of graduate school when tuition costs doubled unexpectedly. They would see the calm voice, the polished manners, the steady hand on my son's shoulder. They would never notice how slowly some people replace you. Not through cruelty, through convenience. The ceremony began with the national anthem and speeches about resilience and bright futures. I clapped when everyone else clapped. I smiled when cameras swept across the crowd. Ryan sat 6 rows ahead wearing his graduation robe and honors cords, taller than almost everyone around him. For a moment, watching him adjust his cap nervously, I saw flashes of the little boy who used to sleep beside me during thunderstorms. The little boy who once cried because I worked overnight shifts at Mercy General Hospital and missed his 2nd grade Christmas concert. "It's okay, Mom," he told me afterward while eating microwave macaroni at 11 at night. "I know you're saving money for my college." Back then, I believed sacrifices stayed visible forever. I was wrong. Halfway through the ceremony, the dean announced that one graduating student had been selected to give a special speech representing the business program. Daniel straightened proudly beside me. Chloe immediately lifted her phone, and Ryan walked onto the stage. The applause thundered through the arena. My chest tightened with pride, so fierce it almost hurt. I remembered every overnight hospital shift, every frozen dinner eaten alone after double shifts, every utility bill paid late, so Ryan could attend football camp or SAT tutoring. I remembered standing outside in freezing January wind when my old Ford sedan broke down after work because I needed enough overtime to cover his textbooks. I remembered pretending not to notice holes in my winter coat because Ryan needed a laptop more than I needed anything else. Ryan smiled into the microphone, nervous at first. "None of us gets here alone," he began. "Success is never just one person." My eyes filled instantly. He sounded so grown up, so confident. Then he said, "When I was younger, I thought strength meant surviving alone. But the man who taught me what real strength looks like is my stepfather, Daniel Brooks." The arena erupted into applause. Daniel lowered his head modestly while people around us clapped harder. Chloe wiped away a tear dramatically. Ryan continued speaking, but I barely heard the words after that. Mentor, guidance, leadership, believing in me. Every sentence landed like another quiet erasure. My name never came. Not once. Not even accidentally. I sat perfectly still with my bouquet resting across my lap, while applause echoed around me like distant thunder. Then something strange happened. I stopped feeling hurt. Hurt is sharp, immediate. What settled over me instead felt colder, clearer, like finally understanding a truth I had avoided for years. 3 nights earlier, Ryan had called me while practicing his speech over speakerphone. I remembered him saying, "I want to thank you for always believing in me, Mom." I remembered hearing pages shuffle in the background. I remembered Daniel's voice faintly interrupting. And now, sitting in that crowded arena while strangers applauded another version of my son's story, I realized something terrifying. Someone had rewritten my son's memories. And somehow, he had let them. I do not remember leaving the arena. I remember the sound of applause following me through the hallway like an echo that refused to die. And I remember one young girl in a graduation robe stepping aside politely so I could pass. Outside, the June heat wrapped around me instantly. Columbus summers always carried that heavy warmth that made the air feel thicker near the pavement. Families crowded the sidewalks, taking photographs beneath university banners, while graduates laughed and hugged each other near the parking garage. A mother nearby fixed her daughter's cap, while a grandfather struggled to open a folding lawn chair. Everyone seemed to belong to someone. I stood there for a moment holding my bouquet against my chest like I had forgotten what it was for. Then I walked slowly toward my car. My knees hurt more than usual that day. Age announces itself quietly in moments like that. A dull ache climbing stairs. Fingers stiffening around car keys. The realization that grief weighs something physical. My old silver Toyota Camry sat beneath the farm maple trees where I had parked early that morning. I placed the flowers carefully in the passenger seat and closed the door without getting inside. Around me, people kept celebrating. Somewhere across campus, church bells rang noon. I leaned against the car and suddenly remembered another June afternoon 20 years earlier when Ryan graduated elementary school. He wore a paper cap made from blue construction paper and waved at me from the cafeteria stage so hard that his little tassel fell off sideways. Afterward, he ran straight into my arms holding his certificate like it was a Nobel Prize. "Did you see me, Mom?" he asked breathlessly. "I found you in the crowd." Back then, he always found me in the crowd. I finally sat down behind the steering wheel and stared at my reflection in the windshield. The woman looking back at me seemed strangely calm. Not angry, not even shocked anymore. Just tired in a way sleep could not fix. I turned the key in the ignition but did not drive right away. Instead, memories came back in fragments the way they often do after something breaks inside you. Ryan at 7 years old sitting on the kitchen counter eating cereal while I ironed my nursing scrubs before sunrise. Ryan at 10 pretending not to notice when the electricity got shut off for 2 hours because I was late paying the bill after his asthma medication refill cost more than expected. Ryan at 14 asking why I never bought anything for myself anymore. Because I already have everything I need, I told him while sewing the loose strap on his football bag at midnight. It was not entirely true, but mothers learn to survive on partial truths. His father, Michael, left when Ryan was 6. There was no dramatic betrayal, no screaming match, just one quiet conversation. At our kitchen table and a packed suitcase near the front door. "I cannot do this anymore, Evelyn," he said while staring at his coffee cup instead of me. A year later, he moved to Arizona with a woman from his accounting office and slowly disappeared into Christmas cards and occasional birthday checks that arrived late. Ryan cried for months afterward. Sometimes I would hear him awake after midnight pretending to sleep when I checked his room. I stopped buying lunch at work so I could afford counseling sessions for him every Thursday afternoon. I worked overnight shifts at Mercy General 4 nights a week during those years. 12-hour shifts under fluorescent lights while machines beeped and exhausted families slept in waiting rooms clutching styrofoam coffee cups. I learned how to survive on vending machine crackers and 3 hours of sleep. Every morning, I drove home while the sun came up over Interstate 71 and Ryan waited for me at the apartment window before school. He used to smile whenever he saw my car pull in. That smile carried me through years I barely remember now. Daniel entered our lives when Ryan was 16. At first, I was grateful for him. Honestly grateful. He brought structure into our small, chaotic world. He fixed things around the house without being asked. Paid for dinners sometimes. spoke to Ryan like an equal instead of a child. The first Christmas Daniel spent with us, he bought Ryan a refurbished pickup truck after mine finally died outside a grocery store parking lot. Ryan looked at him with a kind of admiration I had not seen in years. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway watching them talk about engines while snow fell outside, and thinking maybe life was finally becoming easier. Maybe I had survived the hardest part. What I did not understand then was that love and replacement can sometimes arrive wearing the exact same face. It happened slowly after that. Ryan stopped asking for my advice about colleges and started asking Daniel. The Mother's Day cards became shorter each year, while birthday gifts for Daniel grew more elaborate. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being the center of Ryan's memories and became background. Scenery inside them. Useful. Familiar. Easy to overlook. My phone buzzed suddenly against the console, pulling me back into the present. Ryan's name flashed across the screen beside a photograph taken 3 years earlier at Thanksgiving dinner. He was smiling beside me with his arm around my shoulders. For one dangerous second, I almost answered. Instead, I silenced the phone and looked out through the windshield toward the crowded campus sidewalks shimmering beneath the afternoon heat. Then I noticed something resting on the passenger seat beside the flowers. The folded graduation program Ryan handed me before the ceremony. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up, and that was when I saw the handwritten note in the margin beside his speech title. In Ryan's handwriting, barely visible beneath blue ink smudges, were 6 words that made my stomach turn cold. Daniel says this sounds more powerful. I drove home with the air conditioner running full blast, even though my hands felt cold the entire way. Traffic crawled along Route 315, while families in graduation robes filled every restaurant patio near campus. At one stoplight, I glanced at the bouquet beside me and suddenly realized I could not remember the last time Ryan bought me flowers. It seemed like such a small thought, almost petty, but grief often arrives disguised as tiny observations. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sun had shifted low enough to cast long shadows across the porch steps. My house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. White shutters, small rose bushes near the mailbox, the wind chime beside the front door Ryan made for me in 6th grade during art camp. Everything ordinary, everything untouched. That was the strange thing about heartbreak. The world never pauses to acknowledge it. I carried the flowers inside and set them on the kitchen table without trimming the stems. The house smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and the coffee I brewed before leaving for the ceremony. My graduation outfit suddenly felt uncomfortable, too stiff around the shoulders, too formal for an empty kitchen. I slipped off my shoes and sat quietly at the table staring again at the folded program in front of me. Daniel says this sounds more powerful. 6 words. That was all it took to rearrange years of confusion into something painfully clear. I thought back to 3 nights earlier when Ryan called while rehearsing his speech. "Do you think this sounds okay?" he asked casually over speakerphone. I remember smiling while standing at the sink washing strawberries for dinner. "You could read the phone book and I would still cry," I told him. He laughed softly. Then I heard Daniel's voice somewhere in the background. "Keep it stronger," he said. "Make it inspirational." At the time, it sounded harmless. Supportive, even. Now I wondered how many other moments I misunderstood over the years. My phone buzzed again on the kitchen counter. Ryan. Then immediately after, Daniel. I let both calls ring until the house became silent again. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Chloe this time. "Evelyn, I think there was a misunderstanding today." I stared at the text for a long moment before placing the phone face down. A misunderstanding. That was the favorite language of people who slowly erased you while smiling politely across dinner tables. Around 6 o'clock, thunder rolled softly outside and summer rain began tapping against the windows. I changed into sweatpants, and one of my old Mercy General Hospital shirts faded from hundreds of washes. The television stayed off. Instead, I opened the hall closet looking for an old photo album I had not touched in years. Dust coated the top shelf. Inside the album were school pictures, birthday snapshots, football games, awkward middle school dances, Christmas mornings surrounded by wrapping paper, and cheap toy boxes I bought with overtime pay. In every single photograph, Ryan was looking directly at me. Smiling for me, leaning toward me. There was one picture from his senior year of high school where he stood beside Daniel after winning a debate competition. I remember taking it myself outside the auditorium. Daniel had one hand on Ryan's shoulder, while Ryan grinned proudly at the camera. At the time, I thought the picture represented stability. Family. Looking at it now, I noticed something else entirely. Ryan was dressed almost exactly like Daniel. Same posture, same watch, same careful smile. I turned another page and found a folded paper tucked between photographs. A handwritten essay from Ryan's junior year English class. The title read, "The Strongest Person I Know." My chest tightened before I even began reading. My mother works harder than anyone I have ever met. 13-year-old Ryan had written in crooked blue ink. She falls asleep at the kitchen table sometimes because she works night shifts, but she still helps me study for science tests before school. She says we are a team. I think she is the bravest person alive. I had forgotten about the essay completely. Tears blurred the page for the first time all day. Not loud crying, just silent tears slipping down my face while rain tapped softly against the windows. Because that boy had existed once. The boy who saw me clearly. Somewhere between then and now, someone taught him another version of the story. Around 8:30, headlights swept across my living room curtains. Car doors closed outside. I did not need to look through the window to know who it was. A soft knock came first. Then Ryan's voice through the front door. "Mom." Silence stretched between us. Another knock. "Mom, please open the door." I remained seated at the kitchen table with the essay still in my hands. "I know you are upset," he continued carefully, "but you left before the family pictures." Family pictures. The words settled heavily in my chest. Not "are you okay?" Not "I hurt you." Just disappointment that I missed photographs documenting a version of family where I no longer belonged. I heard Daniel murmur something quietly outside. Then Ryan spoke again, lower this time. "Mom, it was just a speech." I closed the photo album slowly and stared toward the dark hallway leading to his old bedroom. For years, I blamed myself for the distance growing between us. I thought maybe I worked too much. Maybe I worried too often. Maybe I was too emotional or too ordinary compared to people like Daniel who walked into rooms carrying effortless confidence and expensive cologne. But sitting there in my quiet kitchen while rain fell outside and my son stood on the other side of the door defending another man's edits to his memories, I understood something painful. Ryan did not betray me all at once. He betrayed me one small compromise at a time. I did not open the door that night. Eventually, the knocking stopped. Car doors closed outside. Tires rolled slowly down the wet street, and silence settled over the house again like a heavy blanket. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight with Ryan's old essay beside me and the untouched bouquet beginning to droop in its vase. The lilies had already started opening wider, their sweet scent filling the room almost too strongly. Around 1 in the morning, I finally stood up and carried the flowers to the trash bin outside. Rainwater still clung to the porch railing. The neighborhood looked washed clean beneath the streetlights. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then stopped. I dropped the bouquet into the garbage carefully, almost gently. Then I went back inside and locked the door. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always had during my nursing years. Old habits survive long after people stop needing them. For a few seconds, lying in bed beneath the soft blue glow of dawn, I forgot what day it was. Then the memory returned all at once. The applause, the speech, the note in the margin. I stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and realized something strange. I no longer felt shocked, only clear. There is a dangerous kind of peace that arrives after disappointment reaches its limit. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting on the back patio wrapped in a light cardigan with a mug of black coffee cooling between my hands. The sky over Columbus looked pale gray after the storm. Water dripped steadily from the gutters while robins hopped through the wet grass near the fence. For years, mornings had been my favorite part of motherhood. The quiet before responsibilities began. Pancakes before school. Lost permission slips. Last-minute science projects spread across the kitchen table. Ryan used to stumble downstairs half asleep with his hair sticking up in every direction asking if we had enough milk for cereal. Sometimes I missed those ordinary moments more than the big ones. Nobody warns you that motherhood slowly becomes a collection of small vanished routines. My phone remained face down beside me on the patio table. 12 missed calls. For voicemails. Several texts from Ryan. 2 from Daniel. 1 from Chloe saying she hoped we could move past the misunderstanding as a family. I almost laughed reading that sentence. Families do not erase each other by misunderstanding. They do it through repetition, through years of subtle corrections, through carefully edited stories repeated often enough that eventually everyone believes them. Around 9:30, my sister Carol called. "I saw graduation pictures online," she said carefully after I answered. Ryan looked handsome. Carol had always been cautious with difficult conversations, as though speaking too directly might crack something fragile open. "He did," I replied. Silence stretched between us for a moment. Then she sighed softly. "Evelyn, I know that look. You used to get it after double shifts when patients died." I stared out at the wet backyard while wind stirred the wind chime beside the porch. "Do you remember when Ryan broke his arm riding bikes at age 11? I asked suddenly. "You drove me to the emergency room because my car would not start." "Of course I remember. I stayed awake 36 straight hours after that because I picked up extra shifts to pay the orthopedic bill." My voice remained calm, almost conversational. "Ryan cried because he thought the cast made him look weak. So I slept sitting upright beside him on the couch for 3 nights because he was afraid to roll onto his arm." Carol said nothing. "Yesterday," I continued quietly, "my son stood in front of 2,000 people and thanked the man who started helping him when he was 16 for teaching him strength." The silence on the line became heavy. Finally, Carol whispered, "Oh, Evelyn." I closed my eyes briefly. That is the thing nobody understands about betrayal when you get older. It is never just about the moment itself. It is about realizing your sacrifices became invisible long before the final insult arrived. After we hung up, I walked slowly through the house, noticing things I had ignored for years. Ryan's old baseball trophies still lined the living room shelf because he never bothered taking them. A faded growth chart remained penciled onto the laundry room wall from when he was little. 17 years old, 5 feet 10 inches. 18 years old, 6 feet 1 inch. Each mark represented a version of my son who once belonged completely to this home. I opened the hall closet searching for extra blankets and found an old cardboard box shoved behind winter coats. Inside were dozens of handwritten cards Ryan made throughout childhood. Mother's Day cards covered in crooked marker hearts. Birthday notes thanking me for video games or homemade cakes. One crumpled card from age 9 read, "Mom, you are my best friend forever." I sat on the hallway floor holding those cards while sunlight slowly moved across the carpet beside me. Somewhere along the way, Daniel did not simply become important to Ryan. He became the narrator of Ryan's life. And narrators hold dangerous power. They decide who mattered, who sacrificed, who deserves applause. By late afternoon, another message arrived from Ryan. "Can we please talk? Daniel thinks everybody is overreacting." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Not I think. Daniel thinks. Even now, my son still filtered his understanding through another man's approval. I placed the phone down carefully and looked around the quiet house that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to a life no one remembered correctly anymore. And for the first time in many years, I asked myself a question that frightened me with its honesty. If my presence had become this easy to erase, why was I still staying where I was no longer truly seen? 3 days after the graduation ceremony, I woke up and realized I did not want to spend another morning waiting for my son to understand what he had done. That realization arrived quietly while I stood in the kitchen making toast. No dramatic breakdown, no tears falling into coffee cups, just a calm understanding settling into place like the final piece of a difficult puzzle. Outside the window, sunlight spread across the backyard fence while a lawn mower hummed somewhere down the street. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning. Yet something inside me had shifted permanently. I carried my breakfast to the dining room table and opened my laptop for the first time in days. Ryan had continued texting constantly. "Please talk to me. Mom, this is getting ridiculous. Daniel thinks everybody needs time to cool off." Every message somehow made things worse. Even now, he could not speak without including Daniel's perspective beside his own. Around noon, I typed 3 words into the search bar. Lake Cabins, Vermont. I do not know why Vermont appeared in my mind specifically. Maybe because Michael and I visited Burlington once during our first year of marriage before life became complicated and expensive and exhausting. Maybe because I remembered how peaceful the water looked at sunrise. Or maybe because I wanted somewhere cold enough to clear the noise from my head. The listings appeared slowly across the screen. Small cabins, quiet towns, Places with wraparound porches and pine trees, and lakes reflecting open skies. One photograph stopped me completely. A white cottage near Lake Champlain with weathered blue shutters, and a wooden dock stretching into still water. Nothing extravagant, just peaceful. I stared at that picture for a very long time. Then I called the realtor. Her name was Denise Harper, and she sounded surprised when I explained I might want to relocate from Ohio quickly. Most people take months to decide, she said gently. I have spent 22 years deciding. I replied before I could stop myself. Silence lingered briefly on the phone after that. Well, Denise said softly, the cottage is available. That afternoon, I walked through my house slowly room by room for what felt like the first time in years. The living room where Ryan built blanket forts during snowstorms. The kitchen where I iced birthday cakes at midnight after long shifts. The laundry room where I once sat crying quietly after opening another overdue medical bill, while Ryan practiced trumpet upstairs, completely unaware. Every corner held some version of motherhood pressed invisibly into the walls. Yet the strangest part was realizing none of it belonged to Ryan anymore. Memories only survive when two people protect them together. Otherwise, they slowly fade into private history. My phone rang again around 4 o'clock. Ryan. This time I answered. Silence greeted me first, then his relieved exhale. Mom. His voice sounded tired. Younger somehow. I am glad you picked up. I remained quiet. I know you are upset, he continued carefully. But everybody keeps acting like I did something terrible. Everybody. Another word that carried distance inside it. Did you? I asked softly. He hesitated. I thanked Daniel because he helped me through graduate school. He gave me opportunities. I looked around the dining room while he spoke. My old oak table. Family photos. The clock above the doorway ticking steadily through the silence. Ryan. I said quietly. Do you remember your junior year when your asthma got so bad during football season that you spent 3 nights in the hospital? He paused. Yeah. Do you remember waking up at 3 in the morning because you could not breathe? Of course. You were terrified. Silence again. I sat beside you every single night holding your hand because every time I let go, your heart monitor started racing. My voice stayed calm, almost detached. Do you remember that? Mom. Daniel was not there then. The line remained silent except for faint static. I am not asking for applause, Ryan. I continued. I never needed public credit. But there is a difference between gratitude and replacement. He exhaled sharply. You are making this bigger than it was. I closed my eyes briefly after hearing that sentence. Because suddenly I understood the real problem. Ryan truly believed emotional wounds only counted if they happened loudly. He did not understand that quiet betrayals leave the deepest scars. Did Daniel help edit your speech? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. He just made suggestions. About removing me? It was not like that. Then what was it like? His frustration surfaced instantly. Why does everything have to become emotional with you? The sentence landed harder than the graduation. Speech itself. Not because it was cruel. Because it sounded rehearsed. Borrowed. I had heard Daniel say almost those exact words years earlier during an argument about Ryan missing Thanksgiving dinner. You always turn things emotional, Evelyn. Suddenly I could hear it clearly. The same tone. The same irritation toward feelings that complicated his preferred version of events. Ryan was not only repeating Daniel's opinions anymore. He was repeating his language. I opened my eyes and looked toward the hallway where childhood photographs still lined the wall. Then I noticed something strange. I no longer felt the need to defend myself. I hope you have a beautiful life, Ryan, I said quietly. Mom, what does that mean? I glanced back toward the laptop still open on the dining room table displaying pictures of quiet Vermont cabins beside still water and pine trees. It means, I replied softly, I finally understand I cannot keep begging to exist inside someone else's version of my own story. Then I ended the call. The house sold faster than I expected. A young couple from Dayton made an offer 4 days after the listing went online. They walked through each room smiling excitedly while discussing paint colors and nursery ideas. The woman kept touching the kitchen counters, saying how much she loved the natural light near the breakfast nook. I stood quietly beside the realtor listening to strangers imagine futures inside rooms where I had already lived an entire lifetime. Oddly enough, it did not hurt the way I thought it would. Maybe because grief had already emptied the place before the for sale sign ever touched the lawn. On my final morning in Columbus, I woke before dawn and moved slowly through the house, carrying cardboard boxes toward the moving truck parked outside. Most of what remained fit into fewer boxes than expected. A few photo albums, winter clothes, my grandmother's quilt, Ryan's old essay from junior year. The rest I donated or left behind. At some point in life, you realize how little of existence actually belongs to you. Memories take up more space than furniture ever does. Around 7 o'clock, I made one last cup of coffee and sat on the kitchen floor because the table was already gone. The room echoed strangely without pictures on the walls or magnets on the refrigerator. Sunlight slipped through the windows in long pale strips across the hardwood floor. I remembered Ryan sitting in this exact kitchen at age 8 wearing dinosaur pajamas while practicing multiplication flashcards before school. 7 times 6, I would say. 42. He answered proudly with cereal milk still on his upper lip. I smiled despite myself remembering it. Then the smile faded just as quietly. My phone had remained mostly silent since our last conversation. One voicemail from Chloe, saying she hoped time would heal misunderstandings. 2 short texts from Ryan asking where I was. Nothing from Daniel. That did not surprise me. Men like Daniel rarely chase people after they stop being useful to the story. At 9:30, the moving truck pulled away from the curb while I stood alone in the empty driveway, holding my purse and travel mug. My old life sat behind me in a house that already felt like someone else's memory. For a moment, fear hit me unexpectedly hard. I was 67 years old driving alone across several states toward a place where I knew absolutely no one. Most people my age were settling down near grandchildren and retirement communities. I was starting over because my son no longer recognized the shape of my love. Yet beneath the fear, something else existed too. Relief. Quiet but undeniable. The drive to Vermont took nearly 14 hours spread across 2 days. I stopped overnight at a small inn in Pennsylvania where the wallpaper smelled faintly like old books and cedar wood. The woman at the front desk asked if I was visiting family nearby. No, I answered after a pause. I think I am trying to find myself again. She smiled politely the way strangers do when they sense sadness, but understand it is not their place to ask questions. By the second afternoon, the scenery began changing. Busy highways faded into winding roads lined with pine trees and white church steeples. The air smelled cleaner somehow. Colder. Lake Champlain appeared suddenly beside the road like a sheet of silver stretching endlessly beneath the clouds. I pulled over near a small overlook just to stare at it. Water has a strange effect on grief. It reminds you that movement continues even when everything inside you feels frozen. The cottage looked exactly like the photographs. Blue shutters, white porch railings, small dock extending over still water, wildflowers growing beside the gravel driveway. Denise Harper greeted me holding a folder beneath one arm, while wind lifted strands of gray hair across her face. "Welcome home," she said warmly before catching herself. Or at least I hope it becomes one. I almost corrected her. Then I realized I wanted her to be right. The first night there felt unbearably quiet. No traffic outside. No television noise from neighbors. Only crickets and gentle water against the dock beneath moonlight. I unpacked slowly while thunder rumbled far away across the lake. By 10 o'clock, exhaustion finally settled into my bones. I changed into pajamas and walked barefoot through the unfamiliar cottage, turning off lamps one by one. In the small bedroom overlooking the water, I placed Ryan's childhood essay inside the nightstand drawer beside my reading glasses. Some things I still could not throw away. Just before midnight, my phone rang unexpectedly. Ryan. I stared at the screen glowing softly in the dark room, while rain began tapping against the roof overhead. For several seconds, I considered ignoring it completely. Then I answered without speaking. "Mom." His voice sounded strained. Panicked almost. "Where are you?" I looked through the bedroom window toward the dark lake rippling beneath distant lightning. "Somewhere peaceful," I replied quietly. "What does that mean?" "It means I left." Silence filled the line. Then his breathing shifted unevenly. "You sold the house?" "Yes." Without even telling me. The question settled heavily between us because both of us understood the irony instantly. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed holding the phone against my ear. "Ryan," I said softly, "you stopped telling me things long before I stopped telling you." He said nothing after that. Only silence and rain and 2 people finally understanding how far apart they had drifted. The first few weeks in Vermont felt strangely unreal, as if I had stepped into someone else's retirement instead of my own life. Every morning, I woke to soft light reflecting across Lake Champlain and the sound of water brushing gently against the dock below the cottage. No traffic, no hospital sirens, no waiting for messages that never came. Just stillness. At first, the silence unsettled me. I had spent so many years living inside constant responsibility that peace itself felt unfamiliar. I started taking slow walks each morning along the shoreline road wrapped in a thick cardigan against the cool mountain air. Small fishing boats drifted across the water while local shop owners unlocked bakery doors downtown. People nodded politely when passing each other here. Nobody seemed rushed. Nobody demanded emotional explanations. It felt like entering a world where I no longer had to defend my existence. Ryan continued calling every few days during the first month. Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I let the phone ring beside me while I watered flowers near the porch. The conversations never lasted long anyway. He always sounded frustrated before sounding remorseful. You cannot just disappear because of one speech, he told me during one call while I sat watching rain move across the lake. One speech does not make someone leave their entire life behind. I listened quietly before answering. No, Ryan. But years of becoming invisible might. He sighed heavily into the phone the way Daniel used to whenever emotions complicated practical conversations. Mom. Daniel was only trying to help me sound professional. I stared at the water for several seconds before speaking again. Do you know what the saddest part is? What? You still think this is about the speech? Silence followed that. Deep silence. The kind people create when truth enters the room unexpectedly. By early September, the maple trees around the lake had started turning red and gold. The air smelled like pine needles and cold mornings. I bought a second-hand wooden rocking chair from an antique shop in Burlington and placed it on the porch facing the water. Some evenings I sat there wrapped in blankets drinking tea while reading old mystery novels from the local library. Slowly, life began reshaping itself into something softer, smaller, mine. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything shifted again. I had just returned from the grocery store when my phone rang. Carol. Her voice sounded tense immediately. Evelyn, she said carefully. Have you spoken to Ryan recently? My stomach tightened slightly. Not for about 2 weeks. What? She hesitated. Daniel lost a substantial amount of money. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. What do you mean? Bad investments. Apparently some real estate project collapsed. Ryan got pulled into it somehow. Wind rattled the porch screen outside, while Carol continued speaking quietly. Chloe moved out last weekend. I closed my eyes briefly. Not from satisfaction. Just exhaustion. Ryan called me yesterday, Carol said softly. He sounded terrible. I stared across the cottage toward the lake, shining pale silver beneath cloudy skies. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang noon. Did he ask about me? Yes. She paused. He said he found something in Daniel's office. That sentence settled heavily in my chest. What? An old flash drive with drafts of his graduation speech. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Carol exhaled slowly. Evelyn, according to Ryan, the original version thanked you repeatedly. Daniel edited almost every paragraph. I said nothing. Outside, leaves drifted slowly across the yard in cold autumn wind. Apparently there were notes besides several sections. Carol continued carefully. Things like too emotional and focus on leadership instead. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Not because I was surprised anymore, but because somewhere inside me, a small wounded part had still hoped maybe Ryan truly believed those omissions himself. Hearing that another man had deliberately carved me out of my son's words made the loss feel sharper somehow. More deliberate. Ryan kept asking me one thing. Carol said quietly. What? He wanted to know why Daniel would do that. I looked down at my tea growing cold beside me. Because some people only feel important when they are standing where someone else used to be. That night, Ryan called just after sunset. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. His voice sounded raw immediately. Mom. I waited quietly. I found the drafts. The lake outside my window reflected the last pale streaks of evening light. I know, I replied softly. He inhaled shakily. I did not realize how much he changed. You still read the final version. Silence. Then finally, in a smaller voice than I had heard since he was young, he said, I thought he was helping me sound stronger. Tears filled my eyes unexpectedly at that sentence. Not because it excused anything, because I suddenly understood how deeply Ryan had confused emotional distance with strength. Daniel had not simply rewritten a speech. He had taught my son that gratitude looked weak and vulnerability sounded embarrassing. "Mom," Ryan whispered, "I do not think I have been myself for a long time." I closed my eyes while wind moved softly through the pine trees outside. Somewhere far across the lake, thunder rolled quietly beneath darkening skies. "No," I said gently. "I think you spent years becoming someone else's version of who you thought you needed to be." He began crying then, quietly, trying unsuccessfully to hide it. And for the first time since graduation, I heard my little boy's voice underneath the man Daniel had tried so carefully to create. October arrived quietly in Vermont. The trees around the lake burned deep orange and crimson, while cold wind carried the smell of wood smoke through town every evening. I had started volunteering twice a week at the small local library, shelving returned books and helping children find mystery novels after school. The work was simple, peaceful. Some afternoons I would sit behind the front desk watching leaves drift past the windows while elderly couples whispered over crossword puzzles nearby. Nobody there knew anything about my old life in Ohio. To them, I was simply Evelyn, the quiet woman by the lake who always returned books on time and baked cinnamon bread for church fundraisers. There was comfort in becoming ordinary again. Ryan and I spoke more often after his call about the speech drafts, though the conversations remained careful. Fragile, like walking barefoot across cracked glass hoping not to reopen old wounds. He had moved out of the condominium he once shared with Chloe and rented a small apartment near downtown Columbus. Daniel, according to Carol, had become increasingly isolated after the failed investment deals collapsed. Apparently, several business relationships ended badly once money disappeared. None of that brought me satisfaction. Age teaches you that watching people fall apart rarely feels as rewarding as imagined. Mostly it just feels sad. One Friday evening, Ryan called while I was making soup in the cottage kitchen. "Mom," he said quietly, "I found something else." I stirred the soup slowly while listening. "What?" "The original recording." I frowned slightly. "What recording?" "The practice version of my graduation speech before Daniel edited it." My hand stopped moving. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while the soup simmered quietly on the stove. "I listened to it this morning," he continued, voice strained. "I thank you for everything." I closed my eyes briefly. "Ryan, no. You need to hear this." He inhaled unevenly before continuing. "I said you were the strongest person I ever knew. I talked about your overnight hospital shifts, about how you skipped meals so I could go to football camp. I even told the story about you sleeping beside me in the hospital after my asthma attack." Tears blurred my vision instantly, not because I needed the praise now, but because hearing those memories still existed somewhere inside him loosened something painfully tight in my chest. "Then why did you let him change it?" I asked softly. Silence stretched across the line. Finally, he answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "Because I thought sounding emotional made me weak." The words hung heavily between us. Outside, wind rattled the porch screen while darkness settled slowly across the lake. "Daniel always said successful men do not lead with feelings," Ryan admitted quietly. "He said vulnerability makes people respect you less." I leaned against the kitchen counter staring out toward the dark water beyond the windows. "And do you believe that now?" Another long pause. "No," he said finally. "I think it made me forget who actually loved me." A week later, Ryan arrived in Vermont unexpectedly. I saw his rental car pull slowly into the gravel driveway just after sunrise on a cold Sunday morning. Mist floated low across the lake while frost covered the dock rails in pale white crystal. For several seconds, I simply stood at the kitchen window holding my coffee mug watching him step out of the car. He looked thinner than I remembered. Tired. Older somehow despite only being 22. When he reached the porch, neither of us spoke immediately. The silence between parents and children becomes different after heartbreak. Less comfortable. More honest. Finally, Ryan looked down at his hands and said quietly, "I almost drove back 3 times. I opened the door wider. But you did not." He nodded once. Inside the cottage, he sat awkwardly at the small wooden kitchen table while I poured coffee into one of the blue ceramic mugs from the local pottery shop. For a while, we only listened to the heater humming softly through the floor vents. Then Ryan reached into his jacket pocket and carefully placed a flash drive onto the table between us. "The original speech," he said. "I wanted you to have it." I stared at the small silver drive resting beside the sugar bowl. Such a tiny object to carry so much regret. "I listened to it every night this week," Ryan admitted quietly. "And every time I heard myself thanking you, I realized something worse." I looked up at him. His eyes were red from exhaustion. "What?" His voice cracked slightly when he answered. "You never once asked me to recognize you. Not ever." Tears filled my eyes again, because he was finally understanding the one thing I had spent years unable to explain. Real motherhood rarely demands public gratitude. It survives quietly in packed lunches and unpaid bills and sleepless nights and waiting rooms and ordinary sacrifices nobody applauds. Ryan lowered his head into his hands briefly. "I do not know how I became someone who could hurt you like that." I watched him carefully across the small kitchen table while morning light slowly filled the cottage around us. And suddenly I saw both versions of my son at once. The grown man shaped by pride and influence and fear of appearing weak. And beneath him, the little boy who once searched crowded school auditoriums just to make sure his mother was still there watching. "People do not lose themselves all at once," I said softly. "It happens gradually, one compromise at a time." Ryan looked at me then with tears slipping quietly down his face. "Do you think you can ever forgive me?" I glanced toward the lake outside where sunlight had finally begun breaking through the morning fog. The water looked calm again after days of rain. "Forgiveness is not the hard part," I answered honestly. "Trust is." Ryan stayed in Vermont for 3 days. Not because everything was magically repaired, but because neither of us wanted to pretend anymore. The first evening after his arrival, we sat together on the porch wrapped in thick blankets while cold wind moved across Lake Champlain beneath a pale October sky. He asked questions quietly between long stretches of silence. Questions children usually ask years earlier before pride and adulthood complicate everything. "Were you lonely after Dad left? How did you afford my asthma treatments? Did you ever regret giving up so much for me?" I answered honestly because there no longer seemed any reason to protect him from the truth. "Yes," I told him softly one evening while watching geese drift across the lake. "I was lonely often." Another pause. "And no, I never regretted you." He lowered his eyes after that, blinking hard against emotion. On his second morning there, Ryan helped me stack firewood beside the cottage while fog rolled low across the water. The work was simple but comforting in its ordinariness. For years our relationship had revolved around obligations and misunderstandings and unspoken disappointments. Suddenly, we were just two people carrying wood beneath cold autumn trees. At one point, he stopped beside the pile holding a split log awkwardly against his chest. "Daniel always said emotions make people irrational," he admitted quietly. I brushed wood chips from my gloves before answering. "And what do you think now?" Ryan stared toward the lake for a long moment. "I think pretending not to feel things made me cruel." The honesty in his voice hurt almost as much as the graduation speech itself, because I realized how deeply he had suffered trying to become someone incapable of vulnerability. Later that afternoon, we drove into Burlington together for groceries. A small, ordinary trip. Yet I noticed how Ryan kept reaching automatically to open doors for me or carry heavier bags without being asked. Little gestures from the boy I remembered before ambition and influence hardened him into someone unrecognizable. People rarely transform completely. Usually they just bury softer parts of themselves beneath whatever the world rewards most loudly. On his final night in Vermont, we sat beside the fireplace while rain tapped softly against the windows. The cottage glowed warmly in the firelight. Ryan turned the ceramic mug slowly between his hands before speaking. "I saw Daniel yesterday before I drove here." I looked up quietly. "How is he?" Ryan gave a tired half-smile, still blaming everyone else. The fire cracked softly between us. "He said you manipulated me into turning against him." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but exhaustion replaced amusement quickly. "And what did you say?" Ryan stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. "I told him you never asked me to choose sides." He did. Silence settled gently through the room after that. Peaceful silence this time. Not avoidance. Not tension. Just two people finally seeing the same truth clearly. Before bed, Ryan handed me a folded sheet of paper. "I rewrote the speech," he said quietly, "the way it should have been." I looked down at the paper resting in my hands, but did not open it immediately. You do not have to read it now, he added quickly. I just needed it to exist somewhere honestly. After he went upstairs to the guest room, I sat alone by the fire and unfolded the pages carefully. The words blurred through tears almost immediately. The strongest person I have ever known is my mother, the new version began. Not because she demanded recognition, but because she loved quietly. When nobody was watching, I covered my mouth with trembling fingers while the firelight flickered across the pages. Every sentence carried memories only the real Ryan could remember. The emergency rooms, the night shifts, the cheap apartments, the football practices. The years we survived together before someone convinced him survival only counted if it looked polished and unemotional. By the time I reached the final paragraph, tears slipped silently down my face. If success means becoming someone incapable of gratitude, he had written, then my mother taught me a better definition of strength long before I ever stood at a graduation podium. The next morning, frost covered the dock and pine branches shimmered silver beneath the rising sun. Ryan loaded his suitcase into the rental car, while I stood on the porch holding my coffee mug between cold hands. Neither of us rushed the goodbye. Some moments deserve slowness. Finally, he turned toward me with red, tired eyes. I know things cannot go back to how they were, he said quietly. No, I agreed softly. They cannot. He nodded once as though he expected that answer. Then after a long pause, he asked the question I think had haunted him since graduation day. Do you still love me? The pain in his voice nearly broke me because children never really stop needing that reassurance no matter how old they become. I stepped closer and adjusted the collar of his jacket the same way I used to before winter school mornings years ago. Ryan, I said gently, mothers do not stop loving their children, even when they are hurt. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Then why did you leave? I looked past him toward the quiet lake stretching endlessly beneath the pale morning sky. Wind moved softly through the pine trees surrounding the cottage. Because loving someone should never require disappearing inside their version of your story. He cried quietly, then without trying to hide it anymore. And for the first time in many years, I realized something important. Walking away had never been about punishment. It had been about survival. Ryan hugged me tightly before leaving, holding on longer than he had since childhood. Then he climbed into the car and slowly disappeared down the winding lakeside road beneath falling autumn leaves. I stood there long after the sound of the engine faded completely. The lake remained calm. The morning remained cold. And somewhere deep inside me, a wound I thought would stay open forever had finally begun learning how to close.